What were those clever cooking tricks food companies never wanted you to know? In everyday kitchens, these simple tricks stretched groceries, saved money, and turned plain meals into something that felt special. How much of that quiet wisdom has been left behind? Saving bacon grease in coffee cans was one of those thrifty tricks every family seemed to know, though it is rarely talked about today. Instead of tossing out the fat left in a skillet, housewives carefully poured it into empty cans or jars, letting it solidify and waiting until it was needed again. It was free cooking fat, and it carried a smoky richness that butter or oil never could, making fried potatoes, biscuits, or vegetables taste better without buying a thing. For many, this trick stretched budgets, since butter was expensive and sometimes rationed, while bacon was a more regular purchase. Families felt nothing was wasted, and every breakfast with sizzling bacon meant another meal down the road would be flavored with that same essence. It was more than a habit, it was a way of life, born from hard times when throwing anything away was unthinkable. Jell-O molds with cabbage or carrots may sound odd now, but they were once clever ways to stretch meals and sneak nutrition into unexpected places. Housewives grated carrots or chopped cabbage, suspending them in colorful gelatin to create something that looked festive on the table. These salads were not just about taste, but about making scarce vegetables last longer, preserving them in a form that was easy to prepare ahead of time. They also fooled children into eating vegetables without complaint, since they appeared inside a dessert-like dish. It was not fine dining, but it worked, and the visual appeal helped it seem like something special rather than a compromise. This was ingenuity on full display, combining practicality with presentation to get families through difficult years. Homemade mayonnaise from evaporated milk and vinegar was a kitchen hack that gave thrifty families a stand-in for the store-bought jars. When brand names like Hellmann's felt too costly, mothers whisked together evaporated milk, a splash of vinegar, and a little seasoning until it thickened into a creamy dressing. It worked surprisingly well, spreading on sandwiches and mixing into potato salads just like the expensive version. Evaporated milk was shelf-stable and cheap, so it became a reliable substitute in households where fresh milk and eggs were not always available. Families were proud of making something that tasted close enough to fool guests, and many swore they preferred it over the store version. It proved that sometimes the best tricks were the simplest ones, turning humble staples into something that felt indulgent without breaking the bank. Cereal box recipes for marshmallow squares might have been advertised to sell the cereal, but resourceful moms quickly figured out endless spin-offs. The classic crispy rice treat was just the start, with marshmallows melted into butter and mixed with cereal before being pressed into pans. Mothers experimented with other cereals, from cornflakes to wheat puffs, making variations that were cheaper and often tastier than the boxed desserts. The trick was using whatever was on hand, proving that recipes were guides, not rules. This cleverness saved money while still giving children the fun snacks they craved, without relying on the company's packaged versions. It showed how families took corporate marketing and turned it into something of their own, stretching products further and reclaiming control over what they ate. Extending coffee with chicory or roasted barley was a practice that dated back to the Depression and wartime shortages. When a can of coffee had to last weeks instead of days, housewives roasted chicory root or barley until dark, grinding it and mixing it with regular coffee grounds. The result was a brew that looked and smelled like coffee, though it carried a slightly bitter or nutty edge. For families used to hardship, this was a small sacrifice to keep the ritual alive. Since morning coffee was more than a drink, it was a comfort. Children grew up remembering that flavor, not realizing it was part substitution and part survival. For many, this habit stayed long after times improved, a reminder of what ingenuity could achieve. Leftover mashed potato pancakes were a clever way to avoid waste, turning cold potatoes into something new and golden. Housewives mixed the leftovers with a little flour or egg, shaping patties and frying them until crisp on the outside and soft inside. Served with a dab of applesauce or gravy, they became a breakfast favorite that made yesterday's supper feel fresh again. This simple trick kept nothing from going to waste, proving that leftovers did not need to be boring. Families loved the texture, and children looked forward to them almost as much as the original meal. They were quick, affordable, and comforting, embodying the creativity of kitchens that made the most of every scrap. Hot water pie was a dessert born from scarcity when milk, cream, and eggs were too expensive or unavailable. Instead of giving up on pie altogether, women created a custard-like filling using hot water, sugar, a bit of flour, and butter. The mixture baked into a surprisingly silky texture that resembled traditional pies, even though it was made from the bare minimum of ingredients. It carried just enough sweetness to feel indulgent while staying firmly within the budget of struggling families. Hot water pie became proof that determination could turn even the simplest pantry staples into something special. For many, it was a reminder that joy could be created out of very little, and that dessert was never completely out of reach. Meatloaf stretchers with oats or cracker crumbs were lifesavers in families trying to make small amounts of meat feed many mouths. Housewives blended fillers like crushed crackers or rolled oats into the ground beef, creating a loaf that looked hearty while stretching the protein further. Seasonings, onions, and sauces disguised the trick, leaving most none the wiser. Children thought it tasted great, husbands thought it was filling, and families stayed satisfied without realizing how carefully it was stretched. This trick kept food costs down while still providing something that felt substantial, and it remained a trusted secret in countless kitchens. It was less about deception and more about survival, showing that cleverness could keep meals plentiful even when meat was scarce. Using mayonnaise in cakes was one of the best-kept secrets of thrifty kitchens, and food companies were not eager to promote it. The mayo replaced eggs and oil, binding and moistening the cake batter in one simple step. The result was a cake that stayed soft and flavorful, often fooling anyone who took a bite into thinking it was made with expensive ingredients. This hack was passed around in cookbooks and word-of-mouth recipes, proving itself again and again at church suppers and family birthdays. Housewives loved that one cheap jar of mayo could create desserts that rivaled bakery cakes without requiring costly extras. It was a trick that worked so well it became a guarded favorite in kitchens where thrift and pride walked hand in hand. Vinegar pie was another forgotten dessert that shined during lean years, replacing costly fruits with vinegar for tang and balance. The filling was made from sugar, butter, flour, and vinegar, baking into a custard-like texture with a flavor that was sweet yet slightly tart. Families served it warm, often dusted with a bit of nutmeg or cinnamon, making it feel far richer than it was. Vinegar pie proved that resourcefulness could stand in for luxury, offering a dessert that comforted families during times of want. Though unusual by today's standards, it was once a beloved reminder that nothing, not even fruit, was essential for creating something satisfying. It is a recipe worth remembering because it shows how much people achieved with very little. Mock apple pie with Ritz crackers was one of the cleverest desserts to come out of kitchens that had to make something from nothing. Instead of apples, families used crushed crackers soaked with sugar syrup, lemon juice, and a bit of cinnamon, baking it all in a flaky crust. The crackers softened and took on the texture of apples, fooling almost anyone into believing they were eating real fruit. Food companies promoted it to sell crackers, but housewives embraced it as a secret hack that made dessert possible without expensive produce. At the table, no one cared if apples were missing. The flavor was close enough, and the joy of pie was still there. Children thought it was a marvel, and adults appreciated the thrift behind it. This dish showed that resourcefulness was sometimes more impressive than luxury, proving that flavor did not always depend on what you had, but on what you could make out of very little. Powdered milk in creamy sauces was a quiet substitution that made casseroles and soups taste rich even when cream was out of reach. Housewives mixed powdered milk with water and whisked it into gravies, macaroni dishes, and vegetable bakes, giving them body and flavor without needing fresh dairy. It became a hidden tool in households where budgets were tight, and it fooled guests who never realized they were eating something stretched with substitutes. Powdered milk was cheap, shelf-stable, and reliable, which made it indispensable in kitchens that had to plan for lean weeks. Families appreciated that meals still tasted indulgent without draining resources, and children never knew the difference. It was a trick companies did not advertise because they would rather sell real milk or cream, But for housewives, it was proof that ingenuity mattered more than marketing. This substitution made countless casseroles creamy, filling, and memorable without costing more than a few pennies. Bologna steaks were a classic example of turning something humble into something that felt special. Instead of treating bologna as lunchbox meat, families cut thick slices, scored the edges to keep them from curling, and fried them in skillets until crisp and sizzling. Served with onions, gravy, or even mashed potatoes, it gave the impression of steak dinners at a fraction of the price. Children thought it was a treat because the fried edges and smoky smell filled kitchens with excitement. For parents, it was a way to give their families something hearty and celebratory without spending money they did not have. In hard times, this kind of creativity mattered, and food companies selling real meat were less than thrilled about housewives finding cheaper alternatives. Bologna steaks became a small comfort, a reminder that even the least glamorous ingredients could be transformed into meals that felt indulgent. It was both survival and celebration in a skillet. Gelatin whipped desserts were one of those clever inventions that transformed pantry staples into something that seemed elegant, almost restaurant-worthy, even when times were tough. Housewives chilled evaporated milk, whipped it until light and fluffy, and folded it into flavored gelatin, producing a mousse-like dessert that looked fancy without costing much. The whips came in bright colors, carried a playful texture, and felt indulgent enough to appear at birthdays, Sunday dinners, and church suppers across small towns. Children were delighted by the wobble and airy feel, while parents smiled at the practicality of creating something festive out of ingredients already sitting in the cupboard. The recipe was smart because it stretched one small box of gelatin into a dessert that could serve a large family, and sometimes even more. The creamy look also masked the fact that it contained no cream, only canned milk and powdered gelatin. Food companies advertised the gelatin, but never highlighted how little it took to feed a crowd when made this way. In reality, the trick was thrift wrapped in a smile, turning frugality into celebration. Gelatin whipped desserts proved that ingenuity and joy could exist together on the table. Corn fritters with syrup were a farmhouse favorite that combined savory strength and sweet comfort in one affordable dish, filling tables with both joy and practicality. Families stirred cornmeal together with eggs, flour, and either fresh or canned corn, dropping spoonfuls of batter into sizzling skillets until golden and crisp around the edges. Once fried, the fritters were stacked high on plates and drizzled generously with syrup, creating a dish that felt indulgent despite its humble ingredients. They could be served at breakfast alongside milk, at supper with beans or greens, or even eaten plain as a snack in between chores. The recipe stretched corn, one of the most dependable crops of rural life, into something that satisfied hunger and spirits alike. For children, the fritters were a treat, a rare bite of sweetness that carried excitement. For parents, they represented the assurance that no matter how little meat or money was available, the family could still share a filling meal together. Corn fritters with syrup were thrifty, hearty, and cheerful, a reminder that ingenuity could transform the simplest crop into comfort worth remembering. Their memory lingers as one of the cleverest meals born out of necessity. Peanut butter meatballs may sound strange to modern ears, but in kitchens where thrift ruled, they became a clever and dependable dish, balancing cost and nourishment. Meat was expensive, scarce, and often rationed, so housewives stretched it by mixing ground beef or pork with spoonfuls of peanut butter. The peanut butter added bulk, fat, and protein, making the dish more filling while masking the fact that the meat portion was smaller than usual. Rolled into balls and simmered in sauces or gravies, they took on a flavor that was surprisingly hearty, especially when served with rice, noodles, or mashed potatoes. Children embraced the taste quickly, since peanut butter was already beloved at snack time, and parents appreciated how far the mixture could be stretched. For many households, this trick kept meals on the table when paychecks were thin. Food companies selling canned meats had no desire to publicize such recipes, but families relied on them nonetheless. Peanut butter meatballs revealed the quiet ingenuity of blending pantry staples into meals that worked. They were survival turned into creativity, proof that even odd combinations could bring comfort and satisfaction when shared across the family table. Tomato soup cake was one of the most surprising tricks of the mid-century kitchen, hiding canned soup inside a dessert that tasted nothing like what went into it. Housewives mixed canned tomato soup into spice cake batters, where it kept the crumb moist and rich without requiring extra milk or eggs. The soup's acidity deepened the flavor of cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg, producing a cake that was dense, sweet, and unexpectedly delicious. Guests often had no idea there was soup involved, and many housewives kept the ingredient a quiet secret. It was thrifty and practical, since canned soup was cheap and shelf-stable, while baking staples were often scarce. Tomato soup cake was more than just a dessert. It was a symbol of how creativity could outwit scarcity, turning unlikely ingredients into family traditions. It became beloved at gatherings, remembered fondly long after the surprise ingredient was revealed. Homemade ice cream in coffee cans turned dessert into a family game, avoiding the cost of store-bought ice cream machines. Families filled small cans with cream, sugar, and flavorings, sealed them tight, and placed them inside larger cans packed with ice and salt. Children rolled the cans back and forth across the yard until the mixture inside froze into ice cream. It was cheap entertainment, and dessert rolled into one, and everyone remembered the joy of shaking, rattling, and laughing together. Parents loved it because it used only basic ingredients and kept children busy, while the end result was creamy and satisfying. Ice cream companies certainly did not want people realizing they could make gallons of the treat at home with little effort. This trick represented both thrift and fun, proving that even luxury desserts could be created from household items and a little family effort. It was tradition disguised as play. Stuffed cabbage rolls with rice fillers became a staple in households that needed to stretch meat further than usual. Cooks used cheap cuts of ground beef or pork, blending them with rice and onions before rolling the mixture inside boiled cabbage leaves. The rolls were simmered in tomato sauce until tender, turning humble ingredients into a dish that looked elegant and hearty. Rice made the portions larger, feeding entire families with just a small amount of meat. Children enjoyed the warm, comforting rolls, and parents appreciated the efficiency of making food last. Stuffed cabbage rolls carried flavors of European tradition, but adapted perfectly into Southern and African American kitchens where thrift was essential. They became Sunday favorites, proof that filling food did not have to mean expensive food. This was another dish food companies ignored, because it relied on scraps and staples rather than store-bought mixes. Yet it nourished countless tables with pride. Depression era. Water pie crust was an ingenious solution when butter, lard, or shortening were too expensive or unavailable. Housewives mixed flour with hot water and a little oil, creating a dough that could be rolled thin and baked into a serviceable crust. It lacked the flakiness of traditional pastry, but it worked, holding sweet or savory fillings without falling apart. Families appreciated that dessert or dinner pies were still possible even when fats were rationed or unaffordable. It was simple, practical, and surprisingly effective, keeping traditions alive when resources were at their lowest. The trick became a reminder that ingenuity could overcome shortages and that meals were about more than perfection. They were about presence. Water pie crust symbolized the resilience of families who refused to let scarcity rob them of comfort, proving that even the simplest dough could hold together cherished traditions at the dinner table. Pimento cheese spread was one of those frugal recipes that showed how a few simple ingredients could turn into something memorable. Families mixed processed cheese with mayonnaise and chopped pimentos, creating a spread that was creamy, tangy, and bold enough to hold its own without costly meats. It was spread thick between slices of bread, packed into school lunches, or served on crackers at church gatherings. Housewives loved it because it stretched ingredients, turning one block of cheese and a jar of pimentos into days of filling sandwiches. Children thought it was fun because of the bright color, and adults appreciated how far it went when budgets were thin. Pimento cheese became a Southern staple but reached kitchens all across the country during lean decades. It carried pride with it because it proved flavor did not have to be expensive to be beloved. Even today, people who grew up with it remember its taste as comforting, tied to summer picnics, community suppers, and quick meals that felt indulgent even when money was tight. It was one of those tricks food companies wished families would forget because it kept people from needing pricier deli meats. Potato donuts were the sweet, golden proof that nothing in the kitchen needed to be wasted. When leftover mashed potatoes sat in the icebox, clever cooks mixed them with flour, sugar, eggs, and spices to create donut batter that was soft and airy. Fried until golden, the potato donuts came out tender on the inside and crisp on the outside, lasting longer than ordinary versions because the potatoes held in moisture. Rolled in sugar or glazed, they quickly became favorites in homes where thrift and flavor had to coexist. For children, these donuts felt like a treat on par with bakery sweets, even though they were born out of leftovers. Housewives loved how reliable they were, stretching scraps into something people would ask for again and again. It was the kind of kitchen hack that carried families through holidays and everyday mornings alike, filling homes with the smell of frying dough and cinnamon. Potato donuts reminded everyone that resourcefulness did not mean sacrifice, it meant creating joy out of what was already there. Sugar syrup jam preserves were another clever way families stretched what little they had into something that lasted. When fruit was scarce or too expensive to buy in bulk, housewives boiled what they had with more sugar syrup than actual fruit. The result was a sweet, spreadable preserve that could cover bread or biscuits, giving the illusion of abundance even when the jars were mostly syrup. Children loved it because the flavor was bold and sugary, while adults knew it meant the pantry would stay stocked longer. It was also a trick to keep fruit from spoiling, since sugar acted as a preservative, locking in flavor through the winter. This practice was not about luxury, but survival, ensuring that families could enjoy a taste of sweetness on lean days. Though it lacked the chunks of fruit most modern people expect in jam, it carried the same comfort, reminding households that ingenuity was just as important as ingredients. Cornbread in a skillet was the kind of dish that blended thrift and tradition with every slice, making it unforgettable in households that valued resourcefulness. Families poured cornmeal batter into hot cast-iron skillets slicked with bacon grease, letting the edges sizzle into a golden crust that crackled with flavor. The drippings gave the bread a smoky depth, turning it from plain bread into something hearty and rich without adding expensive ingredients. Housewives counted on skillet cornbread to stretch meals, cutting wedges to serve with beans, greens, or soups, so smaller servings felt filling. Children happily broke off pieces to enjoy with butter, honey, or molasses, and parents valued how it repurposed the grease left from breakfast instead of wasting it. Skillet cornbread became more than food. It was a symbol of survival and comfort, proof that one pan and cleverness could feed an entire family. It lived in the rhythm of rural kitchens, showing that homemade flavor carried power companies could never package or sell. Skillet cornbread reminded families that even simple meals, made with patience and scraps, could be deeply satisfying and memorable, and its legacy deserves to remain on the table. Apple cider vinegar drinks, often called Switchell, were the forgotten energy drink of farm families who worked long days under the sun. Mixed from vinegar, ginger, molasses or honey, and water, Switchell was refreshing, inexpensive, and practical for laborers who needed hydration. Farmers carried it in jugs into the fields, sipping steadily to stay cool and energized without buying soda or bottled drinks. Children often drank it watered down and remembered the sharp tang as a taste tied to summers of heat and harvest. Housewives admired that it cost only pennies to make compared to store-bought beverages, especially during times when families guarded every cent. Food companies tried marketing alternatives, but Switchell held on in rural areas because it was reliable, flavorful, and connected to the cycles of work and community. Though it has largely disappeared today, its place once stood as vital, offering both nourishment and comfort. Families could always mix another jug, knowing it was their own, homemade, sustaining drink. Cabbage and noodles, often called halooki, was one of those thrifty dinners that stretched scraps into something sustaining, and it proved just how much could be done with little. Families fried chopped cabbage with onions and butter or leftover drippings, then tossed everything with boiled noodles, making a dish that was hearty without demanding much money. Meat was rarely included, but if there happened to be a slice of bacon or sausage, even a small piece flavored the entire pot. Housewives valued the recipe because it required only a few inexpensive ingredients, yet filled bowls generously. Children were happy with the buttery noodles even if they pushed the cabbage aside, and adults knew it kept stomachs satisfied during the hardest seasons. The dish became a tradition among immigrant neighborhoods where European families had long relied on cabbage, and soon African-American households adapted it too, mixing thrift with comfort. It spread across America in decades when paychecks were thin, proving that comfort food did not need to be complex or costly to matter. It was cheap, practical, filling, and dependable, which made it a household treasure. Cabbage and noodles was survival disguised as warmth, and it deserves to be remembered. Spam and pineapple skillet meals were a clever pairing that made canned meat feel like something tropical and even glamorous, despite being born from necessity. Housewives sliced spam into neat cubes, browned them in a skillet, and tossed them with canned pineapple chunks, onions, and peppers. Suddenly, the salty meat transformed into a bright, sweet, and savory supper that felt fresh out of Hawaii, even when made in small kitchens thousands of miles away. Children loved the sugary bite of pineapple, while parents appreciated how quickly the dish came together on hectic nights. It carried with it a feeling of festivity, a reminder that even rationed or cheap foods could be dressed up to feel celebratory. Food companies sold the spam, but it was housewives who stretched it, making it taste like more than emergency pantry meat. The combination became a favorite for church suppers, potlucks, and weeknight dinners, remembered with surprising fondness even years later. It was clever, resourceful, and joyful all at once. Spam and pineapple skillet meals proved that frugal food did not have to be boring, and that a little creativity could elevate the humblest can into a dish worth remembering. Drippings gravy, known as Redeye gravy, was one of those dishes that kept absolutely nothing from going to waste, and it turned scraps into flavor. After frying country ham in a skillet, housewives whisked the salty drippings with strong black coffee, creating a thin but bold sauce poured over biscuits or grits. The bitterness of the coffee cut through the richness of the fat, making it taste deeper and more complex than its simple ingredients suggested. Families leaned on it in mornings when ham was scarce, knowing that even a spoonful of drippings could stretch flavor across an entire plate. Children sopped it up with bread, while adults appreciated the jolt of sharpness it gave. It was not glamorous, but it was deeply practical, proving that nothing in the skillet was ever wasted. Redeye gravy became part of the rhythm of breakfast in the South, born from necessity but remembered for its distinct taste. It was simple, frugal, and rooted in resourcefulness, a dish that food companies could never package because its meaning came from the act of saving and stretching. Redeye gravy was a memory of ingenuity passed from stove to table. Homemade salad dressing powders were a thrifty answer to the expensive seasoning packets companies tried to market, and families created them from ordinary pantry spices. Housewives mixed onion powder, garlic powder, dried herbs, salt, and pepper together, storing the blend in jars that could be whisked with oil and vinegar whenever needed. The result was dressings as flavorful as store mixes, but without the ongoing expense, and each household adapted the recipe to its own taste. Families enjoyed adding more herbs, experimenting with paprika, or stirring in sugar for a sweeter version. It encouraged people to use vegetables more often, because salads suddenly felt exciting again without breaking the budget. Housewives loved the independence of never relying on store packets, and children enjoyed the fresh taste without realizing it was homemade. It was practical, empowering, and inexpensive, proving that commercial convenience was never truly essential. These powders became a secret weapon in thrifty kitchens, spreading flavor and saving money at once. They turned simple greens into something families wanted to eat. In the end, homemade salad dressing powders were part creativity, part quiet rebellion, a forgotten trick that deserves recognition. Potato skins as snacks were born long before restaurants marketed them as appetizers, and they were the result of housewives refusing to waste a single peel. After peeling potatoes for suppers, Thrifty cooks fried or baked the skins until crisp, then sprinkled them with salt for a savory, crunchy bite. Children snatched them straight from the pan, often dipping them in gravy or ketchup, while adults paired them with soups or beans to add variety. What most people considered garbage became an unexpected treat, proving that scraps could be treasures. Housewives valued them because they stretched meals further without costing anything extra. They were also a moment of creativity, reminding families that food did not need to be expensive to be enjoyable. Years later, restaurants would commercialize the idea, but the real roots of potato skins lay in kitchens where every scrap mattered. Potato skins carried the joy of discovery, turning thrift into something fun. Ground beef and peanut butter stew sounds like a dare, but it was actually a smart Depression-era solution that made a quiet return during the 1960s. You browned ground beef with onions, added canned tomatoes, and stirred in a big spoonful of peanut butter. That was it. Somehow, it worked. The peanut butter melted into the stew, giving it a nutty richness and silky texture that made it taste like something much fancier. You could serve it over rice or eat it with bread. Either way, it was filling, affordable, and shockingly good. It came from the tradition of using pantry staples to bulk up basic meals, especially when meat was scarce. Peanut butter added protein, calories, and a hint of sweetness that made the tomato stew feel like something more. Some recipes added beans or chili powder, others kept it simple. This stew was rarely written in official cookbooks. It was passed down through word of mouth or scribbled in the back pages of community newsletters. But for those who remembered it, it was unforgettable. It was the kind of recipe that taught you how to be bold, even in a tiny kitchen. Roasting root vegetables directly in campfire coals was one of the simplest yet most powerful cooking methods passed down through generations. Without ovens, pots, or fancy tools, native cooks understood that the earth's hidden foods, things like carrots, turnips, onions, and yams, could be transformed into sweet, hearty meals with nothing more than time and fire. Raw roots were buried in the hot, glowing coals of a dying fire, slowly roasting under layers of ash and heat. As they baked, their natural sugars caramelized, their fibers softened, and what once was hard and bitter became soft, rich, and deeply satisfying. Pulling a roasted root from the coals was like uncovering buried treasure, the skin blackened and crisp, the inside steaming and tender. And speaking of patience, some of the sweetest flavors ever created by native chefs required even longer waits, like gathering and boiling maple sap into a clear, nourishing water that tasted like spring itself. Pine needle broth was one of the forgotten miracle foods of early America, a natural tonic hiding in plain sight. At a time when vitamin deficiencies could mean life or death, Native American healers knew that boiling fresh green pine needles would release a flood of nutrients, especially vitamin C. It was not just medicine, it was survival in a cup. The flavor was bright, almost citrusy, with a faint earthy bitterness that made you feel stronger just breathing it in. Families would drink pine needle broth during harsh winters, through long hunting trips, and whenever sickness crept too close. In many ways, it was the original energy drink, long before anyone ever dreamed of cans and chemicals. Modern science eventually caught up and confirmed what traditional cooks already knew. The forest was its own pharmacy, if you knew where to look. And the best part? It took almost nothing to make. Just water, heat, and a handful of needles plucked with respect from a living tree. But sometimes, even when no pot or pan was available, native chefs found a way to cook hearty, life-saving meals using nothing but stones, fire, and ancient ingenuity. Preventing brown sugar from hardening by adding a slice of bread was a classic pantry hack recommended in Betty Crocker's cookbooks to keep this essential ingredient soft and easy to use. Brown sugar naturally tends to dry out and clump when exposed to air, making it difficult to scoop and measure. Placing a small piece of fresh bread in the container created a humid environment that helped maintain moisture in the sugar, preventing it from hardening. This simple yet effective trick saved time and frustration in the kitchen, especially for recipes requiring smooth brown sugar. It was a practical solution embraced by mid-century cooks who valued convenience and resourcefulness. The hack minimized waste and kept baking processes running smoothly. Betty Crocker's advice highlighted attention to detail in everyday cooking, reinforcing the importance of small habits that improved kitchen efficiency. This trick continues to be widely used by bakers seeking to preserve the quality of their brown sugar. Stretching meat with bread or cereal in meatloaf was a frugal mid-century tip that helped bulk up protein dishes affordably without sacrificing flavor or texture. Betty Crocker's recipes frequently included soaking breadcrumbs or crushed cereal in milk or water before mixing them into ground meat. This not only increased the volume of the loaf but also added moisture and tenderness, making the meatloaf go further on a tight budget. The technique was especially popular during the Depression and wartime rationing when meat was expensive and limited. Using pantry staples to extend precious protein allowed families to feed more mouths with less meat, reducing waste while maintaining satisfying meals. This clever hack became a foundation of home cooking for generations and is still taught in some classic recipe collections. Understanding this method reminds modern cooks that frugality and flavor can coexist and that simple ingredients can elevate economical dishes. Old-fashioned Johnny Marzetti was not just a dish, it was a whole era in one casserole. Ground beef, elbow macaroni, tomato sauce, and shredded cheese came together to make a meal that never failed to deliver. It started in Ohio, where a restaurant gave it a name, but soon it was all over the Midwest, printed in cookbooks and passed between families. It was made in big metal pans, usually on Sundays or when relatives came over. You browned the beef, stirred in the cooked macaroni, added the sauce, canned or homemade, whatever was available, and topped the whole thing with cheese. Then you baked it until the top browned and bubbled. It was a dish that could sit on a counter for an hour and still be good. It fed a crowd, reheated like a dream, and always reminded you of some aunt or grandma who made it best. Johnny Marzetti was cheap, filling, and dependable. It was also quietly brilliant. With 1 pound of meat and a box of pasta, you had dinner for days. Some people added olives or mushrooms, others kept it plain. What mattered was that it showed up, and it always did. Salisbury steak casserole was the homemade version of a frozen food legend. Instead of pulling a silver tray from the oven, families made their own from scratch, and honestly, it was usually better. This version called for seasoned ground beef shaped into thick oval patties, then baked in a mushroom and onion gravy. It was rich, saucy, and had that stick-to-your-ribs kind of feel. If you were lucky, someone would sprinkle crispy fried onions on top during the last few minutes in the oven, adding that perfect crunch to an already comforting dish. It was not a fancy meal, but it felt like something special. Some people added Worcestershire sauce or a splash of soy for extra umami, but most just used canned soup and a good hand with salt and pepper. You would serve it with mashed potatoes, egg noodles, or a slice of white bread to sop up all that gravy. Kids loved it because it tasted like fast food. Adults loved it because it was hearty and cheap. Rock boiling is one of those lost arts that feels almost too wild to be real, but it absolutely was, and it still works today if you know how to do it. Picture this. You have no metal pot, no pan, nothing but a fire, a handful of food, and a riverbank full of stones. Native American cooks would heat large, clean rocks directly in the fire until they were almost glowing, then carefully drop them into hollowed-out bowls made of bark, animal hide, or clay. The heat from the stones would bring the water to a bubbling boil almost instantly, allowing them to cook stews, boil roots, or even prepare medicinal teas without ever burning the vessel. It was a skill that could mean the difference between an empty belly and a full one. And it was not just functional. It gave the food a subtle mineral richness you cannot replicate any other way. Today, rock boiling feels almost mythical, a forgotten page from a cookbook written by the earth itself. And speaking of earth, some of the most astonishing bread you have never tasted was baked without an oven, without a pan, and sometimes without anything more than a pile of hot ashes. Rock boiling is one of those lost arts that feels almost too wild to be real, but it absolutely was, and it still works today if you know how to do it. Picture this. You have no metal pot, no pan, nothing but a fire, a handful of food, and a riverbank full of stones. Native American cooks would heat large, clean rocks directly in the fire until they were almost glowing, then carefully drop them into hollowed-out bowls made of bark, animal hide, or clay. The heat from the stones would bring the water to a bubbling boil almost instantly, allowing them to cook stews, boil roots, or even prepare medicinal teas without ever burning the vessel. It was a skill that could mean the difference between an empty belly and a full one. And it was not just functional. It gave the food a subtle mineral richness you cannot replicate any other way. Today, rock boiling feels almost mythical, a forgotten page from a cookbook written by the earth itself. And speaking of earth, some of the most astonishing bread you have never tasted was baked without an oven, without a pan, and sometimes without anything more than a pile of hot ashes. Using a coffee filter to strain broth or sauces was an innovative technique promoted in Betty Crocker's cookbooks to clarify liquids and achieve smooth textures. This method involved pouring warm broth, stock, or sauces through a coffee filter placed over a bowl or pot, which caught fine particles, impurities, and sediment. The result was a clear, clean-tasting liquid free of cloudiness or unwanted bits. This technique was especially useful for homemade stocks or gravies, where a refined appearance was desired for elegant presentation. Betty Crocker's recommendation of coffee filters as an accessible kitchen tool showcased creative problem-solving without requiring specialized equipment. This trick fit well with the mid-century emphasis on presentation and quality in home cooking. It enabled home cooks to produce restaurant-style dishes with minimal hassle. Using coffee filters for straining remains a clever and practical tip for cooks aiming to perfect the clarity and texture of their liquids. Flavoring with Worcestershire sauce may sound simple today, but for Grandma it was a genius shortcut that elevated humble beef into something richer. Just a few drops added layers of flavor that made plain ground beef taste almost like a steak. The tangy, savory depth of the sauce seeped into every bite, transforming burgers, meatloaf, and skillet meals into dishes that felt more special than their modest ingredients suggested. At a time when seasoning options were limited and spice cabinets weren't as stocked as they are now, Worcestershire was a miracle in a bottle. It was affordable, versatile, and long-lasting, which made it a kitchen essential. Families grew up on meals where that little splash of sauce was the secret no one talked about but everyone tasted. It gave ground beef a boldness that kept it from feeling repetitive, even if you ate it several times a week. Today, with so many sauces and condiments available, this old trick feels almost too simple to remember, but its impact remains undeniable. It was a way of making the ordinary extraordinary, with nothing more than a quick shake of the bottle. Hungarian hamburger bake brought a little old-world flair to the weeknight dinner table. This casserole took seasoned ground beef and paired it with wide egg noodles, paprika, sour cream, and cheese. You would layer everything into a baking dish, then bake it until the noodles were tender and the sauce was bubbling and golden on top. It was creamy, smoky, and deeply satisfying. The paprika added warmth without being too spicy, and the sour cream gave it that signature tangy richness. It was not exactly authentic Hungarian cuisine, but it borrowed enough to make you feel like you were eating something a little exotic. The recipe was especially popular in Midwestern kitchens, where Eastern European immigrant traditions were still alive and well. It was the kind of dish that made you feel cultured without straying too far from your comfort zone. Most of the ingredients came from cans, boxes, or the fridge, nothing fancy or hard to find, and that was the whole point. The secret of grease preserves is one of those survival tricks that almost defies belief today. After cooking meat, Native American chefs would save every drop of rendered animal fat, pouring it carefully over shredded or chopped pieces of the meat inside clay pots or animal bladders. Once sealed, the fat hardened into a protective barrier that kept bacteria and air out, preserving the meat for weeks, even months. This was not just storage. It was insurance against famine, sickness, and scarcity. Meat preserved this way stayed rich, flavorful, and nutritious, providing vital energy when fresh food was impossible to find. Every time someone dipped into a pot of grease preserves, they were eating a lesson in patience, gratitude, and survival. But even the best preserved meat needed help lasting through long journeys or seasons, and sometimes the land itself offered the perfect cold pantry, hidden just beneath your feet. Turning river stones into griddles for perfect flatbreads is one of those ancient tricks so clever it almost feels like a fairy tale. Large, flat stones were carefully selected, cleaned, and then heated slowly over open fires until they held a consistent, even warmth. Once hot enough, balls of simple dough, made from cornmeal, acorn flour, or other gathered grains, were slapped down onto the stones. There were no skillets, no pans, just direct primal cooking at its purest. Even today, traditionalists who practice stone cooking say you can taste the river, the fire, and the earth in every bite. And back then, when every meal needed to last as long as possible, even cooked meat was treated like a precious currency. That is where one of the oldest and most ingenious preservation methods came into play, using nothing but animal fat and wisdom passed down through generations. Using a pastry blender for quick biscuit dough mixing was a time-saving technique recommended in Betty Crocker's cookbooks to achieve tender, flaky biscuits with ease. The tool helped cut cold butter or shortening into flour quickly and evenly, creating small, fat pockets essential for flaky layers in the baked biscuit. Using a pastry blender reduced the effort and mess compared to mixing by hand or with forks, making the process more efficient and accessible. This method was favored in mid-century kitchens where homemade biscuits were a breakfast staple or accompaniment to meals. Betty Crocker's inclusion of this tool in her cookbooks reflected the growing availability of specialized kitchen gadgets designed to simplify cooking tasks. The pastry blender helped home bakers achieve consistent biscuit textures, elevating everyday baking. This technique remains a fundamental tip for anyone wanting perfectly flaky biscuits without hassle. Using tomato soup as sauce was one of Grandma's simplest but most dependable shortcuts for flavor. With a single can of condensed tomato soup, she could take plain ground beef and transform it into a meal that was hearty, tangy, and comforting. The soup added moisture, preventing casseroles, skillet suppers, or even simple beef and rice dishes from becoming dry or bland. Its sweet, slightly tart taste gave the meal a richness that stuck in memory, tying dishes to the familiar red and white cans stacked in cupboards across America. Families grew up with that signature flavor, recognizing it immediately as the taste of comfort. For Grandma, it wasn't about cutting corners, but about using what she had wisely, and tomato soup was a pantry item that always delivered. With one can and a pound of beef, she could have a hot dinner ready that satisfied everyone at the table. Today, the trick feels nostalgic, but back then it was a piece of kitchen magic built out of practicality and care. Beef and cottage cheese bake sounds like a weird combination today, but it was considered smart back then. The ground beef was browned and seasoned, then mixed with egg noodles, onions, and generous scoops of cottage cheese. Sometimes there was sour cream, sometimes there was tomato sauce, but it always ended up creamy, savory, and just the right kind of filling. It was especially good for households trying to add protein without buying more meat. Cottage cheese was cheap, and it lasted longer than you expected. This was a casserole that blended dairy and meat in a way that was not fancy but worked. It came out of the oven bubbling, with a top that browned slightly and a center that held together like lasagna without the effort. You could serve it straight from the pan, and it held heat like a dream. Some versions added peas or bell peppers for color, others stayed pure and beige and soft. Either way, it filled the belly and made people happy. In a time when families were cutting coupons and stretching paychecks, this was a dinner you could count on. Simple, practical, and more delicious than it had any right to be. Trapping natural wild yeasts for bread making was a delicate dance between patience, instinct, and trust in nature. Long before modern yeast packets made baking effortless, native chefs understood how to harness the living cultures floating invisibly all around them. They would leave simple mixtures of ground corn, acorn flour, or other grains mixed with water exposed to the open air, letting wild yeasts and beneficial bacteria settle into the mix over several days. Every loaf was alive, shaped by the air, the season, and the land itself. Each region had its own distinct flavors, a fingerprint left by invisible forces. It was slow, careful baking rooted in the rhythms of the world, not the ticking of a kitchen timer. And if you thought that was incredible, imagine making an entire soup without a pot, without a bowl, just heated rocks, fresh herbs, and the oldest cooking trick you have never heard of. Making fluffy rice by adding a pat of butter before serving was a finishing touch that added richness and enhanced flavor to simple steamed or boiled rice. This technique, recommended in Betty Crocker's cookbooks, involved stirring in butter just before serving to coat the grains, giving the rice a glossy appearance and a smooth, buttery taste. The addition of butter elevated plain rice from a basic side dish to a comforting accompaniment suitable for a variety of meals. This simple step also helped prevent the rice from clumping together, improving texture and appeal. The tip reflected mid-century home cooks' desire to make everyday dishes more enjoyable with minimal effort. Buttered rice fit well with the era's emphasis on richness and indulgence in family meals, especially when other ingredients were modest. This finishing touch continues to be a beloved way to prepare rice, combining ease and flavor in classic American cooking. Fish wrapped in leaves and steamed over coals was a method so simple and brilliant that it feels almost sacred now. Native American cooks would gather wide, sturdy leaves like those from corn, squash, or even certain wild plants, and use them as natural steam pockets. A freshly caught fish, often seasoned with wild herbs and crushed berries, would be carefully wrapped and placed near smoldering coals or atop heated stones. As the heat rose, the moisture trapped inside the leaves would slowly steam the fish, keeping it impossibly tender, flaky, and infused with the faint, earthy flavor of the leaves themselves. When the leaves were finally peeled back, what you found inside was a dish so fresh and alive you could almost taste the river still running through it. Meals like these were more than food. They were rituals of respect for the land. And speaking of sacred gifts from the earth, few treasures were more important to survival and celebration than the humble acorn ground and transformed into something that would feed generations. Mixing in stale bread soaked in milk was one of those Depression-era tricks that turned necessity into brilliance. Instead of wasting old bread, Grandma would soften the slices in milk until they were almost mush, then fold them straight into ground beef. This gave the meat extra volume and body, while the milk kept it tender and juicy. It was a way to bulk up meatloaf, burgers, and patties without making them dry or heavy, and no one at the table felt like they were eating less meat. The bread simply disappeared into the mixture, leaving behind a moist, flavorful dish that stretched further than a pound should. This practice also reflected a mindset where nothing went to waste and every scrap was valuable. Today we might see it as a quaint old trick, but back then it was survival and comfort in one. It made meals not only possible but memorable, because they were built out of creativity as much as ingredients. With this method, Grandma could take what might have been thrown away and transform it into something hearty, filling, and deeply satisfying, a true testament to the resourcefulness of kitchens from that era. Sloppy Joe pie was what you made when a sandwich was not quite enough. The sweet, tangy beef, made with ketchup, mustard, and maybe brown sugar, got spooned into a dish and topped with biscuit dough or pie crust. Then it baked until golden and bubbly. It smelled like school lunches and weekday nights. The filling was classic Sloppy Joe, but the crust gave it shape. You could eat it with a fork. You could add cheese. Some families topped it with cornbread or mashed potatoes instead. It was a recipe that adapted to whatever was in the kitchen. What never changed was how satisfying it felt. One pan, one meal, one good reason to sit down and eat. It was often made after a sandwich dinner when the meat outlasted the buns. Sloppy Joe pie made the most of what was left and still gave you something to look forward to. It was humble, but proud, made for people who did not ask for much, just something warm and maybe a little sweet. How native chefs made instant trail mix with dried berries and nuts is a perfect example of simple genius meeting real-world survival. Long before colorful packages lined grocery store shelves, Native American communities were gathering handfuls of nature's purest energy foods, drying them carefully under the sun, and combining them into powerful portable meals. Wild berries like chokecherry, elderberry, and wild strawberries were prized for their tartness and nutrition, while nuts like acorns, walnuts, and pine nuts packed a heavy punch of fat and protein. Some tribes even added roasted seeds, puffed grains, or strips of dried meat for extra stamina. The goal was not just taste, but endurance. It was survival in your pocket, designed by thousands of years of knowledge. And while they packed sweetness and strength into every bite, when it came to seasoning savory meals, native chefs turned to another source altogether: wild plants that turned every piece of meat into pure wilderness flavor. Adding a pinch of salt to sweet pie fillings was a subtle seasoning tip that Betty Crocker's cookbooks shared to balance and brighten dessert flavors. While salt is often associated with savory dishes, its inclusion in fruit or custard fillings enhanced the overall taste by cutting through sweetness and amplifying natural flavors. This small amount of salt helped prevent the dessert from tasting overly sugary or one-dimensional. It was especially effective in pies featuring apples, berries, or pumpkins, where a touch of salt brought out depth and complexity. The trick encouraged home bakers to think beyond basic sweetness and embrace flavor layering. This technique reflected mid-century culinary wisdom that even simple ingredients could be used strategically to improve results. Adding salt to sweet fillings became a hallmark of thoughtful dessert preparation, elevating humble pies to memorable treats. The tip remains a valuable lesson for modern cooks seeking balanced and nuanced sweets. Using toothpicks to test cake doneness without drying was a delicate method to check baking progress without damaging texture. Instead of inserting a knife or fork that might remove too much batter or leave large holes, Betty Crocker's recipes often suggested using a clean toothpick to poke the cake lightly. If it came out clean or with a few moist crumbs, the cake was done. If batter stuck to it, more time was needed. This simple tool avoided disturbing the cake's surface and ensured even cooking. It was a practical hack that home bakers swore by to avoid underbaked or overbaked results. Though easy, this test required gentle hands and attention to detail, embodying the care classic cooking demanded. Modern bakers still use toothpicks, but many forget its original intent as a precision instrument rather than a quick poke. Adding grated carrots or zucchini into ground beef was a quiet, clever trick that served multiple purposes in Grandma's kitchen. It wasn't only about making the beef stretch further, though that was a big part of it. It was also about slipping in extra nutrition without anyone noticing. Carrots added a natural sweetness that balanced savory flavors, while zucchini added moisture that kept burgers, meatloaf, or casseroles from drying out. Grating the vegetables fine meant they disappeared right into the beef, and kids usually had no idea they were eating vegetables at all. In a time when every ingredient had to be used wisely, this method made sense because it extended protein portions and made meals healthier at the same time. It also gave the beef more body and volume, turning one meal into two without anyone feeling shortchanged. This trick carried a sense of care, because Grandma knew how to make meals nourishing as well as filling. Today, with rising costs and an emphasis on hidden veggies, this old idea feels surprisingly modern. It's a reminder that cleverness in cooking was never about fancy ingredients, but about small adjustments that turned the ordinary into something bigger and better than expected. Using mayonnaise to keep meatloaf moist was an unexpected ingredient tip that Betty Crocker's cookbooks offered to ensure tender, juicy results in this classic dish. Incorporating mayonnaise into the meat mixture added fat and moisture, preventing the meatloaf from drying out during baking. This simple addition helped maintain a soft texture, enhancing the overall eating experience. The trick was especially helpful in times when leaner cuts of meat were used or when cooks wanted to stretch ingredients without sacrificing quality. Betty Crocker's advice reflected an understanding of ingredient functionality and an innovative approach to improving traditional recipes. This method contributed to meatloaf's reputation as a comforting, reliable meal that families could enjoy regularly. Using mayonnaise in meatloaf demonstrated the mid-century home cook's creativity and willingness to experiment with familiar pantry items. It remains a popular secret for achieving the perfect meatloaf today. Preserving herbs in oil for longer freshness was a smart pantry trick, cherished in vintage kitchens to keep garden herbs usable well beyond their natural shelf life. Instead of letting herbs wilt or dry out quickly, home cooks would finely chop fresh herbs like parsley, thyme, or rosemary and pack them tightly into clean glass jars. Then they would cover the herbs completely with olive oil or vegetable oil, sealing the jar tightly to prevent air exposure. This method created a flavorful, herb-infused oil that could be used in cooking or as a finishing touch for dishes. Not only did this technique extend the herbs' usability through winter months, but it also captured their fresh flavors in a convenient form. This old-fashioned preservation trick was especially valuable before modern freezing and refrigeration methods were widespread. It allowed families to enjoy the taste of summer herbs year-round without the cost or waste of constantly buying fresh produce. Rediscovering this method today offers a delicious way to add fresh herb flavor to everyday meals with a touch of nostalgic practicality. Mixing in oats instead of breadcrumbs was one of Grandma's thriftiest and most reliable tricks, and it worked better than most of us realize. Rolled oats blended right into ground beef without taking away from its flavor, and because they absorbed juices, the beef stayed moist instead of drying out. Oats also gave meatloaf and patties a lighter texture that felt more filling, which mattered when you were trying to stretch a single pound to feed an entire table. For families who grew up in leaner times, this clever substitution was about more than thrift. It was about making meals last. Oats were affordable, always in the pantry, and easy to work with, which made them the perfect stand-in when breadcrumbs weren't available. The beauty of this trick is how seamlessly it fit into daily cooking. Most people couldn't even tell oats were hidden inside. Today, it's often overlooked because modern recipes default to breadcrumbs. But in truth, oats gave those classic dishes their old-fashioned heartiness. It wasn't just about saving money, it was about getting the most out of what you had and never letting an ingredient go to waste, which was the very spirit of Grandma's kitchen. Pick your favorite kitchen trick in the comments, hit like if it made you smile, and subscribe for more food secrets companies hoped you'd forget.